Have you ever had that one friend or met someone in your life that you do like despite the fact that they made an awful first impression? Hello Win, hope you've shaved your neck lately. We can think of a bunch of PS1 games that have that problem too, not the hairy neck thing. Throughout the console's lifespan, there have been plenty of titles that were deemed to be stinkers at the time of release, but have since blossomed into beloved titles thanks to multiple reasons. With that in mind, we've compiled a list of PS1 games that aged, maybe not like a fine wine, but a nice bottle of Lucozade. Tizer? Remember Tizer? How do you follow an FPS game that genuinely redefined single player and multiplayer gaming in the console space? The short answer is, you don't, which is unfortunate for 007 Tomorrow Never Dies, which had the unenviable task of being the next James Bond game after 007 GoldenEye for the N64. You know, the widely beloved and well-regarded shooter that became the poster child for a whole generation of local gaming. No matter how good 007 Tomorrow Never Dies turned out to be, it was never going to stand up in comparison to its predecessor, which led to the game receiving average at best review scores when it launched on the PS1 towards the end of 1999. Despite the tepid reception, 007 Tomorrow Never Dies is still a pretty decent third-person shooter/stealth hybrid, which is probably another reason why TND didn't make too much of a name for itself when it launched. It is kinda hard to compete in the third-person stealth shooter genre when the PS1 already boasted such genre-defining hits like Metal Gear Solid and Siphon Filter. Still, despite everything, the use of gadgets, clips from the movie, and the inclusion of some fun set pieces, such as the opening level's ski chase finale, help keep the action fresh from beginning to end. I vividly remember running around that opening level for like an hour and being totally lost when I was young. Anyone else? I also really like The World Is Not Enough on PS1, maybe more than GoldenEye? Yes, I am a sick man. The problem with being the second one at doing something is twofold, as you lose a lot of your unique appeal while inevitably living in the shadow of what came before. When Tony Hawk's Pro Skater first launched in 1999, it set a standard and a precedent for what 3D skateboarding games could accomplish, which was of course a problem for the team at Z-Axis, who were set to launch Thrasher Presents Skate and Destroy just a few months later. Z-Axis's take on doing sick trinks Z-Axis's take on doing sick tricks on a plank of wood with wheels was a lot more realistic than Tony Hawk's Pro Skater's more arcadey approach, which allowed the game to review well, particularly with regards to the game's technical capabilities, but Skate and Destroy failed to gain traction with the wider public. Sink trinks. Looking back though, Thrasher Presents Skate and Destroy is a game miles ahead of its time, considering a lot of the formula and ideas showcased here would become a core part of the Skate series, one of the most beloved sports franchises of all time. Levels in Thrasher were all free roam, with players able to initiate their timed 2-minute sessions at any point once they found a great line or section to skate in. While the game pioneered ragdoll physics in order to make bails, translation, falling on your face, arse or both, at least a little funnier. There was a vision for Thrasher Presents Skate and Destroy, and while you could make the case that the technology wasn't quite there to execute the vision properly, the ideas behind Skate and Destroy have been proven good by what's come afterwards. We're thinking of the next game. See if you can force the answer out of us. Psychically. Ooh yeah, it has been at least a couple months since the psychic force hive has arisen. The PS1 was a breeding ground for some of the best fighting games of all time, really. Tekken 3, Bushido Blade, Marvel vs. Capcom, Soul Edge, Street Fighter Alpha 3. The point is that fighting game fans were eating very good indeed. With such a great selection of fighting games to choose from, it's no surprise that a certain few games fell through the cracks, and while some of them definitely deserve to be forgotten, Games like Psychic Force were unfortunate victims of obscurity. In a lot of ways, Psychic Force could be seen as a precursor to what would become the Dragon Ball Z Budokai games, as Psychic Force featured 3D characters that could move freely across the 2D plane. Fights took place inside giant cubes, with the gameplay revolving around smashing your opponent into the sides of the cube in order to deal any damage. While Psychic Force was able to spawn a sequel along with an enhanced port of both games on the PS2, Psychic Force was considered a critical and commercial failure for Taito. It's a shame, as even though Psychic Force isn't the most complex fighting game ever made, it's unique and innovative and still worth checking out, especially if you really can't wait for that new Dragon Ball game Sparking Zero, and also it's really cool. Funny story, I actually got banned from Boy Scouts of all places for refusing to give another kid back his copy of this game. Yeah, I'd do it again. Not to be confused with The Fish, the film, the various comic book characters of the same name, or whatever Sagat says when he throws out a fireball. No, not Sagat, Sagat. Tiger Shark for the PS1 doesn't even have anything to do with dragging humans under the water and tearing them apart with your teeth. That, of course, is FIFA 95. Instead, it's one of several games on the PS1 that lets you pilot some kind of weird vehicle, with other notable inclusions being Slamscape and Forsaken. Tiger Shark's main gimmick is that you control a submarine capable of properly operating while submerged and at the ocean surface as well, which was considered to be pretty revolutionary at the time. As you'd expect from a game composed entirely of water levels during the relatively early phases of 3D game design, Tiger Shark received a smattering of bad to average reviews, though the main complaint at the time was aimed at the game's difficulty, along with the lack of real gameplay variety across the game's 10 missions. Still, the gameplay ideas shown in Tiger Shark haven't really been explored in games since, well, beyond Subnautica anyway. While Tiger Shark is far from being described as the best game ever seen on the PS1, the reviews at the time do a disservice to this underrated whipper. If you liked Ace Combat but wish it was a lot wetter, you won't do much better. And if you enjoyed Chicken Run, this next game should be a lot of fun. We can all agree that Chicken Run is one of the best films ever made, yeah? Good. Aardman is a wonderful animation company, and we should worship the ground they walk on, even if it's only because we think Feathers McGraw will get us if we don't. Glad we're all on the same page. Anyway, back during a time when movie tie-in games were more commonplace and the quality often ranged from poor to diabolical, there were a few gems that had cut through the crap. We've already talked about 007 Tomorrow Never Dies, while Toy Story 2 Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue is a genuinely beloved 3D platformer, but not enough people talk about Chicken Run on the PS1. As a game, Chicken Run isn't earning any points for originality, cribbing a lot of the formula of Metal Gear Solid and applying it to this funny and ridiculous Great Escape parody. Imagine if Revolver Ocelot laid eggs, and you have the right idea, kinda. Basically, you'll be running around Tweedy's farm searching for items and completing objectives while avoiding the Tweedies themselves, their vicious dogs and searchlights. Admittedly, it's one bandana and a codec call away from turning into Metal Gear Solid, but the aesthetic and minigames here managed to keep players engaged and set Chicken Run apart. Reviews did skew more positive than other games on this list, but its unoriginality drew plenty of criticism, while some reviewers also lambasted Chicken Run's controls. That might be fair, but again, who doesn't want MGS but with chickens? We've already got monkeys, foxes and skunks, why not chuck a chicken in? Right, try saying that 3 times fast. Chuck a chicken in, chuck a chicken in, chuck a chicken in. There's something universal in the feeling of enjoyment that comes from blowing things up in video games. It's just fun to cause carnage on a massive scale. Rest in peace, Mercenaries, and many developers for the PS1 capitalised on this feeling with a variety of driving games about causing widespread mayhem. Carmageddon is the most famous example, but if you're looking for something a bit more obscure, Felony 1179 is worth checking out, even if it's got the most bonkers story known to man. Basically, imagine Nathan Drake dug up an ancient coffin. He always bloody does that, the rascal, but the only way to open it was by stealing some money, escaping the cops, and buying some ancient keys. This is the same plot as the National Treasure show on Disney+, and you can't prove otherwise, as then you'd actually have to watch it. Also known as a Runabout in Japan, which I love, Felony 1179's gameplay was actually widely beloved by reviewers at the time, with many enjoying the core concept and gameplay. What soured people on Felony 1179 though is the perceived lack of replay value, as even though the game contained plenty of unlockable vehicles, there were few actual levels to play through, leaving some players to feel like they'd seen everything after just half an hour or so. Perhaps more strangely, some reviewers felt like the game could have done with some good old-fashioned pedestrian murder. There was probably those same reviewers who got bent out of shape when traditional media started perceiving video games as too violent. Remember fellas, video game violence, it isn't real. Just look at this box art and tell me this wouldn't be the coolest thing you'd ever seen as an 8-year-old back in 1999. Or a 32-year-old in 2024. Imagine Kung Fu Panda, except way more violent and from the perspective of Tai Lung instead of Po, and you've got the basic idea of what Tai Fu Wrath of the Tiger is all about. It's an even funnier comparison to think about when you consider that Tai Fu was developed by DreamWorks Interactive and Kung Fu Panda was produced by DreamWorks Animation. We're not saying there's some inspiration there, but we wouldn't be surprised either. Look at this guy and then look at this guy. Anyway, as the last surviving member of the Tiger Clan, the titular Tai Fu swears revengeance on the Dragon Master in an attempt to avenge those he's lost. Along the way, you'll learn a bunch of other Kung Fu styles too, such as Mantis, Monkey, and Crane. Maybe chicken, chuck a chicken in. Reviews for Tai Fu Wrath of the Tiger range from stellar to stagnant, with the average setting at around mid at best. A lot of reviewers at the time went to the tried and tested line of worth a rental just to let players know that it's decent but not worth the asking price. The main criticisms include the fact that the game was considered too easy, along with the abilities that Tai Fu earns during the game being a bit slow to unlock, with many considering the back half of the game to be more fun than the front half. Despite those criticisms, if you're looking for a fun beat-em-up, Tai Fu Wrath of the Tiger is definitely worth playing. If nothing else, it's better than the actual Kung Fu Panda games. Anyone who's played Showdown of Legendary Legends is entitled to compensation, I'd say. Jeez. Researching this has really highlighted the idea that some things are considered bad just by virtue of the fact they're not something else. While it's far from Jersey Devil's only problem, this PS1 platformer had tight competition when it launched in 1997/1998, as by the time it had launched, the PS1 had already been blessed with games like Gex, Croc, and, most importantly, Bubsy 3D. Sorry, we meant the first two Crash Bandicoot games. Meanwhile, another platforming genre mascot in Spyro was set to launch a few months after Jersey Devil, and Nintendo had already made magic on the N64 with Super Mario 64, leaving this platforming game about a really specific urban legend out to dry. Critics also weren't that kind to Jersey Devil, citing a frustrating camera in particular as one of the biggest bugbears, but those who stuck with Jersey Devil found a game filled with a cartoonish charm. Taking a Halloween meets Looney Tunes approach to the design, you control the Jersey Devil itself, who looks more like a bat here, as they tried to stop the evil Dr. Narf from releasing an army of mutant vegetables to take over the world. Somehow, just chucking loads of bunnies, that'll sort it out, right? It's silly, broken, but ultimately fun, and led developers Megatoon to create an actual Looney Tunes game in Bugs Bunny Lost in Time thanks to a partnership with Infogrames, who, by the way, got brought back from the dead not long ago. Nowadays, you might know Megatoon as the people behind Dead by Daylight, since they rebranded later on to become known as Behaviour Interactive. Jersey Devil in DBD when? Make it happen, cowards. Also, put Bruce Willis in it. Segway!
Suck on this! Suck on
When you've got one of the biggest box office stars of the time in Bruce Willis adorned on the game's cover, you're gonna attract some attention, and that's certainly what Apocalypse did when it launched on the PS1 in November of 1998. Not only was Bruce Willis's face on the cover, but John McClane himself also provided his voice and motion capture performance for the character of Trey Kincaid, which has to rank among the most stupidly masculine names ever committed to a game. Because Activision invested millions of dollars into Bruce Willis's involvement in Apocalypse, many were expecting Apocalypse to be some kind of world changer, but the results weren't quite that, but it was still pretty good. Reviews for the final game were considered average at best, and while no one outright hated the game, it wasn't the world beater you'd expect with Bruce Willis front and centre. Despite their lackluster reception though, looking back on a game like Apocalypse proves it to be a silly but enjoyable twin-stick shooter, a genre that was only really in its infancy during the PS1 lifecycle. Remember, twin analog DualShock controllers had only been released for the PS1 about a year before the release of Apocalypse, so a game like this was really at the forefront of a new kind of experience, or if nothing else, it was a silly game that decided to make the President of the United States one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, and we love our silly games here. Speaking of silly, does anyone have a copy of JoJo on PS1 spare? I can give you 10 quid. History has proven that video games about robots you can build fighting each other are pretty cool, so it's a shame that RoboPit from developers Altron wasn't reviewed too well when it first launched on the PS1 in 1996. Reviews from the time were particularly critical of the fact that the game's single-player offerings were rather sparse, boiling down to a series of 100 fights with other robots, and the graphics weren't to everyone's taste either. But it's what RoboPit does with its customization and multiplayer that earned it some praise. Even then though, that praise came with caveats, such as the fact that the PlayStation Link cable wasn't supported, even though the Link cable was ultimately an expensive and largely forgotten piece of kit that required 2 TVs, 2 PS1s, and in most cases 2 copies of the game you want to play. 90s gaming. So nice you had to do everything twice for no reason. RoboPit's core premise is as simple as it gets, as it allows you to customize the different body parts and weapons of a robot before duking out with other robots, with the player receiving new weapons if they win. In a masterstroke move though, players were able to save their best robots to their memory card and utilize them in multiplayer, so people could take their memory card about to their friend's house to pit their best robots against each other. These days you'll just boot up Armored Core 6 and laser sword each other online, but back in 1996, RoboPit was the prototype for something more. Altron did release a sequel as well, which added more RPG elements, but for our money, the simplicity of the first RoboPit showcases the creativity of PS1 games at their very best. And that was our video looking at some bad, quotation marks, PS1 games that were good actually. No quotation marks, that's the truth. What PS1 games that critics didn't like did you like? I've got a pretty good recommendation. Batman and... well, no, not really. What's on my shelf that people didn't like? Evil Dead, Hail to the King? I always thought that was pretty stupidly good in a terrible way. I think it's worth playing. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.